it to the class. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. I am Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the library, and I'm really delighted to welcome so many of you here today to what promises to be a really fascinating talk about The Locked Safe, a family memoir with Miriam David and Charlotte Reiner. So we'll hear from them, and then there'll be hopefully a little bit of time for question and answer at the end as well. Without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. So Miriam E. David is Professor Emerita of Sociology of Education at University College London. She has been a teacher, researcher and head of department at various universities in England and the USA. Her research is on education, family, feminism and gender. She edited with Marilyn Moose, Debating the Zeitgeist and Being Second Generation in 2021. Charlotte Reiner is a graduate of the University of Cambridge in Modern and Medieval Languages. She also holds master's degrees from the University of Durham and University College London. She is an experienced teacher and has taught in a range of both primary and secondary schools, and she is currently working as a freelance private tutor. So I'll hand over now, I think, first to Miriam.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that lovely introduction. Everybody hear me? Or do I have to? Oh, the mic is here, sorry. Can everybody hear me? I'm delighted that there are so many people here, and including old friends and a contributor to the book that was just mentioned here. And I want to thank the Wiener Library for inviting us to give this talk. The timing is unfortunate because we'd hoped that my son Toby will be able to be here to hear the talk and discussion, but he's not been able to come because his wife's father is seriously ill. Charlotte is going to talk after I've given the larger presentation, and she's going to talk about her father rather than talk about my family, but it is her family, and her family, her father's family, were Jewish refugees from Hungary, and she sees herself as third generation. And there is a question mark about whether or not my sister Anne, who's at the back there, and I feel to be a second generation because we just had a father who was a refugee from Nazi Germany or Nazi persecution. Our mother's family, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment, were from Ukraine, and were called Russian refugees or Russian residents at the time. But they did play a part, and I'm going to concentrate on my parents' relationship before they got married in the period 1940 to 1941. So, first of all, I want to talk briefly about the origins of the Locked Safe and why the book is called The Locked Safe. And it's partly to do with my elder sister. I was one of three. I'll just have some. Gone the wrong way, sorry. That's a picture of my daughter Charlotte and her father in Hungary when we were on a roots trip to find out about Charlotte's Hungarian background. And this is a picture of my family, two pictures of my parents with my two sisters and myself. I'm the one sitting on my father's shoulders, and my sister Anne is the baby. and my elder sister Judy's something I want to say about now. So first of all, I want to say that the origins of the book lie as much with my elder sister, who sadly died at the end of January, having lived in Hammerson House for over 3 years. But she was very involved in the origins of the book. And 20 years ago now, in 2005, she wrote a talk for the New North London Synagogue about her own journey of discovery, going to Frankfurt am Main, Niederwohlstadt and Friedberg, which is where our grandparents came from. And she then went there with her late husband and 2 of her 3 sons. The trip was in 1996, so almost 10 years previously. But she was so inspired by David Baddiel's own discoveries about his German Jewish grandparents and internment on Who Do You Think You Are? So she finished her talk with a very dramatic sentence: "This history must not be forgotten." And I cited her words early on in the book, and I actually took her words as an order to finish finding out about the history and to ensure it's not forgotten. This is partly why I've structured the book as I have, but I also regard the book as my own complex and emotional backstory in Britain and from my family from Germany. So this lunchtime, I'm going to focus on a short but a bit of this long and circuitous family history, which was and I'm going to focus, as I've already said, mainly on the period 1940 to 1941. So the book is basically about finding out about the David family from Germany and the Lichinskis from Russia, escaping anti-Semitism and or persecution and pogroms across different generations. We, my younger sister Anne, who's at the back there, and I, found a locked safe with 5 German passports with Nazi insignia on it after my mother died in January 1996. And so the cover picture, which I showed before, is a picture of the lock safe with the passports. My father had died 16 years previously, and we hadn't explored any of this history particularly. Oops. But this is the cover of 4 of the passports that we found. They have the Nazi insignia on them inside the German eagle. Oops, sorry. And these are pages of what each one of them, 4 of the passports look like. That's my grandfather, that's my grandmother, that's my great-grandmother, who arrived in 1939, aged 84, and she lived another 5 years. And this is my great aunt. It's my grandfather's younger sister, Clara. This is my father's passport that we found amongst them. And he arrived on his 28th birthday in 1936. So he arrived 4 years, almost 4 years before his parents and grandmother arrived. And so we wanted to explore how these passports, about which we knew virtually nothing. We did know that my father and his family came from Germany and that they were refugees, but we didn't know when. We were never told much of this detail. So the book is an exploration both of what we knew and what we didn't know and what we weren't told. In addition to the lock safe, we found a large collection of papers and two very precious old albums over 100 years old, and photos from Auntie Clara and my great-grandmother Bertha, pictures over 125 years old. So it was quite a treasure trove of documents that we found. And we also found finally, and this is the thing that I'll concentrate most on, was a brown bag full of the most precious letters between my father learning to speak English and to my mother, mainly about the indignities of internment by the British and its aftermath in 1940. Much of the material that we found has moved a lot. Postcards posted in Manchester or in Frankfurt or Berlin, and taken first to Manchester, then some to South Africa, where my father's elder brother went, and then to the USA and back to London. And I also needed the help of somebody who spoke German, because my German wasn't good enough to read and translate a lot of their handwriting. Quite fortunately, 2 or 3 years ago, my old school friend was willing to help translate the German for free. She'd read German at university, and her professor, Keith Spalding, was also a refugee, and she became intrigued by the whole process, having known my parents. The passports gave us some information about the David family that we didn't know, as did the Association of Jewish Refugees, and they gave us various slips. That's my father's passport, and this is an AJR slip that was filled in by my father when he arrived, and it gives his address when he first settled in Manchester. And for example, I should say that, oops, sorry. The passports give us some information also about what the Germans required of people as they were leaving, as late as my grandparents did leave in 1939. They'd made it a legal requirement by then to add the name Israel for a man or Sarah for a woman for all Jews. And this was after 1937 and 38. So we can see that there for my Aunt Clara and for my great-grandmother. She had the name Sarah added. So their passports didn't reflect quite who they were, and there was a question of how that changed. So my grandparents and my great aunt arrived in July the 31st, 1939. So just a month before the war broke out. And it was that fascinated us about how they survived during that period of the war. We had known quite a lot of information about the happy side of my father's life in Germany. We didn't know anything about the particular effects of the war on my family. For example, my father's elder brother, Ernst, both my father and his brother had been born in Frankfurt, and their mother was born in Friedberg, and their father was born in a small town called Niedervollstadt. But we never knew the detail about what had happened to the family. So I've got a lot of material in the book about who they were and going back over the generations there. For example, we never knew, although it was told us, we thought, I think, as a kind of joke, that my grandfather had actually fought in the First World War. We don't know for how long. Actually, we haven't got the records about that, but he may well have been away for 4 years. But his brother-in-law, and we didn't know he had an elder sister called Selma, and we found the gravestone for them. But we didn't know all this detail. His brother-in-law had been killed in the First World War and had got the Iron Cross posthumously for fighting in northern France. My grandfather actually applied for the Cross of Honor from the Germans in 1935, hoping that it would save him from the Nazi persecution. And it was to celebrate 20 years after World War I. And there is evidence about him having received it in 1935. He hoped it would save him from Nazi persecution, but it did not. And it didn't help his son Ernst either, who in 1938, after Kristallnacht, was imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp for 5 months. He was allowed to leave the concentration camp and come to Britain on guarantee of leaving the country. And this is where my mother's family began the process of being involved in getting my family out of Germany. My mother had been born in Manchester on May Day 1909 and had become, had very good, she'd gone to Manchester University and trained to be a teacher, and she'd become very well known as a teacher in Manchester, and we were always meeting friends of hers when we were growing up. My parents had met in this period of time between 1936 and 1939. And finally, and we do say a bit more in the book about this, there's detail about them going on holiday, my mother going on holiday in 1939 to France. And while she was on holiday there, my father sent her a postcard saying, "All four arrived safely at Ringway Airport." That was July the 31st, 1939, and a month before war broke out. And my Uncle Ernst had come 3 months previously, and my father and he were renting a house or renting rooms in a house in Woodland Road, where my father had been living in South Manchester before that. But they couldn't find anywhere for their parents to live, so they had to live in rooms. And then a week later, they managed to find, quite by coincidence, and this was hard to find documents about, they moved next door to 76 Woodland Road, which became the family home for 11 years. And there's lots of evidence about what happened there then, because it became my grandparents used it as a semi-boarding house, and everybody who stayed there during the war had to fill in an official slip. And we got the whole record of these slips. They were kept in my grandfather's files. It seems my grandparents passed on this habit of hoarding postcards and paraphernalia to, luckily in a way, to their son, and both sons, and then to me as well. So I have got all these documents that I had to go through in either German or English. In 1939, just before, just after war broke out, sorry, on the 29th of September, the British government decided to take an official register of where everybody was living instead of taking a census. So in the National Archives, you can get records of where all your relatives, if they were alive in this country then, were living. But we discovered that although all the German side of my family were on the records, it also said that my Uncle Ernst's records were closed and closed for 100 years from September 1939, which meant that we had no means of getting them. But I did ask for a freedom of information request and got the whole pile of his records in August 2020. That was in the middle of COVID, and I think the National Archives were being particularly generous. They sent me a massive file of paper again. But my mother was not living where, she wasn't living with her mother where we thought she was living. And she always told us she lived with her mother until she got married. Turns out that on the official records, and it's quite clear it was her because it was her correct date of birth and so on, she was living as a head teacher about 40 or 50 miles north of Manchester. But she soon gave up this job as head teacher of a primary school and moved back to Manchester. Okay, the other issue I wanted just to raise is, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten quite where I am in terms of these slides. That this is my father and his brother in 1910. And I always think of my two grandsons over here as being very like these. They're a bit older now. And this is a picture of my grandmother with her sisters. My father sent a postcard to his father from Nice, where he moved in 1934, with, and you can see a massive swastika on the postcard, which presumably was the only kind of postcard he could send at the time. This is where my great-grandparents lived, and Bertha's the one that came to England and lived till the grand old age of 89. This is a postcard of their village. And this is the house of the man whose husband died in July 1915 and got the Iron Cross. And we also found a Jewish cemetery in this village of Niederwohlstadt. And this is Tobias David's gravestone in that tiny cemetery, which had been restored when we went there. And this is my grandfather's sister Selma's gravestone, and she died very young, as well as her husband having died young. This is my father's elder brother. That's my father with the hat on. And he's the one that was in Dachau for, and this is a record of his AJR slip when he arrived in England. And we can see who was his guarantor on it, which was my mother's brother-in-law, who was 20 years older than my mother. So the rest of the story, I just want to spend about 5 minutes talking about, or 10 minutes, is how during 1940 and 1941, my father and his brother were interned in this house. In But just to go back for a moment, on the 20th of May 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister, he argued to collar the lot of the Jewish refugees from Nazism, who were already called enemy aliens. And there were about 30,000 of these who were interned. And this is the year that was the most dramatic and the key to my book and my story. It's the year, as I've already mentioned, of the indignities of internment. From my father's point of view, it meant that he lost his job that he'd come to and been invited to at Kendall and Gent in Manchester. He was there as a machine tool designer, but he lost his job, and he did tell us he was arrested at work. And he had to go with his elder brother, Ernst, and his father to Huyton near Liverpool, first of all. And they were interned as enemy aliens or in prison without trial. The three women who'd come, being elderly, were called internees at liberty, as if that were possible. But we know shades of similar kinds of things happening today. And on the 20th of June, 1940, my mother wrote in a tiny little diary that we have, "Jewish refugees not wanted, why?" And she was extremely upset about the turn of events. She got engaged just a month before. My grandfather and Uncle Ernst and Kurt spent over 3.5 months in Huyton. There's very little evidence about what it was like, but except for 3 packed postcards that we have from my grandmother to the 3 men there. But my grandfather was sickly by then and in hospital, so he was returned home to Woodland Road towards the end of September 1940. He'd barely been in the UK for a year by that point. Meanwhile, my mother fought very hard to get them all released, and she spent a week in London visiting Parliament to see MPs and ministers in August 1940, but she wasn't very successful. Her brother Joe also tried to help by visiting my father's old Jewish professor of machine tool engineering from Berlin, who'd actually been invited here by the government to help with the war effort. Professor Schlesinger had been imprisoned by the Nazis in Germany in 1933 to 34, but then he was allowed to leave Germany, but without any money or a pension. And eventually he moved to Loughborough, and he wasn't interned, but he couldn't help my father because he wasn't allowed to, and there are letters about that. But instead of them being released by my mother's efforts, Kurt and Ernst was sent on October the 10th, 1940 to this house. These 2 houses there were where they were interned on the Morah camp in Ramsey on the Isle of Man. And there's evidence still of the barbed wire concreted into the road. So these houses also held up to 1,000 men in them there. The women's camps were separate and even more isolated than the men's camps. So my father and his uncle and his brother Ernst spent another 4 to 5 months living behind the wire, as Yvonne Creswell put it. Ernst was released in February 1941 to farm work in Cheshire. So by that point, he had spent 5 months in concentration camp Dachau and 8 months interned in Huyton and on the Isle of Man. Over a year of his life, and it took his toll. The freedom of information request that I made was relatively inconsequential, except that it may have related to him living in Bletchley, or more likely, he made a mistake on the forms that he filled in. And so, but Ernst, after all these events, left England in 1950, flying to Johannesburg with his wife and daughter Joan, and my father never saw him again. So they'd had this brief period during the war of being closely together, but he died at the age of 53 of Parkinson's in 1961. Back to 1941, my Uncle Joe had a friend who we called Auntie Eileen, who was the wife. She was very senior. She was the wife of the managing director of Jonathan Cape. And they also tried to secure my father's release. And it was probable that a friend of hers was most helpful in government. It was a man called Lord Lytton, and he spoke in the House of Lords about saving refugees. But the job he got for my father was as a machine operator, not as a machine tool designer. And it was in Ware, not in London, and not in Manchester, where his family had settled. So he had to go to Ware from this house from March 1941 to August 1941. And he wrote over 12 long, anxious and angry letters about his digs, his landlady, and the job to my mother. And the letters were the ones found in the brown bag. He desperately, as he put it in one of his letters to my mother, wanted to contribute to Hitler's overthrow. And he even went at one point to visit government departments on a Saturday morning to try and get his auxiliary war service permit, but was unsuccessful. And it probably may have delayed the receipt of it because of him going to do that. However, my parents did marry as they planned on the 22nd of June, 1941. And my mother wrote in her diary, "The day grand, went with a thrill, everyone kind." It was also the day that Hitler escalated the war with Operation Barbarossa. And finally, my final couple of points are that my mother knew when she married my father that she would lose her British citizenship by marrying an enemy alien. And she did. And she had to buy back her British citizenship after her wedding. And that's what I did. Here, this is the letter saying that she'd lost her British citizenship, and she had to apply to the Home Office for a certificate of naturalization and pay the appointed fee of 5 shillings. She did this through a friend of hers who became the Lord Mayor of Manchester, a man called Leslie Lever. And he and his brother were very famous Labour MPs eventually. And we have a letter mentioning that on the file. But nevertheless, for a woman who was highly educated and so on, and that may have been the reason why she was able to get her citizenship back. She felt it was very ignominious to be treated in this way by the British government. And the British government have actually never apologized or compensated either the David family for internment and its consequences, or to my mother for losing her British citizenship and having to buy it back. And 5 shillings in 1941 was quite a considerable amount of money. So I think she felt this as very undignified, and she fought very hard. And I'm very proud of the way in which my mother fought to try and save her, first of all, her husband's family from from Germany, and then fought to try and get them out of internment. And this is the end of my bit of the story, and I'm going to hand over now to Charlotte. But just before I hand over to Charlotte, I want to say I'm going to give, we have a copy here of the book to give to the Wiener Library. We also have some copies of the book for sale afterwards, if anybody would like to buy a copy of it. But over to you now, Charlotte. Oh, Barbara, how does Charlotte? I know.
Move through when I want to go to a different slide.
Yeah, so I'll just get this up. Where is it?
The lock's safe, yeah. Thanks.
So you can either do that.
Yeah, or use that.
Those.
Yeah,
so that's forward,
thanks.
that's back.
Can I make it full screen?
Yes.
Enable content. Thanks. Okay. Well, I'm very honored to be speaking today here. I've always been fascinated by the Holocaust, and I spent a lot of my childhood immersed in reading books about the Holocaust. Here is a copy of one of the books I read, which my mother always used to tell people that I wrote to her, and my mum, and she answered and said I was her youngest reader. I think you're always saying how proud you were. And this was another one of the books I read about the Holocaust, which I recommend if you haven't read it. Actually, even for my degree, I did my degree in French and Spanish, but I wrote about books about the Holocaust for my dissertations, both of them actually. So when my mother asked me to write a chapter in her book, I decided to write about my father's mother and her experiences in Hungary, because she was in hiding during the Second World War. The year I wrote my chapter marked the 50th anniversary of her death from cancer. Here's a picture of her with my father as a baby, and that's taken in Hungary. I'm named Charlotte Reiner in her honor, as she died in September 1973, almost 6 years to the day before I was born. I wanted to read an excerpt from my book, from the chapter. My grandmother Charlotte was born into a Jewish family in Hungary on the 10th of September 1915, as the First World War was raging across the globe. Her father Mordechai was a soldier on the German side in the war and died from his wounds when she was a young baby. She grew up with her mother and many siblings in Barks, a tiny village on what is now the border between Hungary and Croatia. Her family were very poor, but Charlotte recognized the importance of education and was determined to become a teacher. She was successful in obtaining a scholarship to a teacher training college in Miskolc, a large Hungarian market town. She moved there, and after completing her studies, she secured her first job as a teacher of English. It was in Miskolc in the early 1930s that she first met my grandfather, Bela Reiner, known to me and his other grandchildren as Grandy. My Grandy was born in Hungary on the 29th of May, 1905, into a religious Jewish family, but he met Charlotte during a rebellious period in his life when he identified as an atheist. His father, therefore, strongly disapproved of their relationship and thought that Charlotte was not religious enough for his son, and he urged Bela to break up with her. Very much still under his father's influence, he agreed, and they went their separate ways. Charlotte moved to Budapest to take up a teaching position, whilst Béla stayed in Miskolc. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Hungary, under the leadership of Horthy, I think I say it right there, was an ally of Germany. Life became progressively more unpleasant for Hungarian Jews because of widespread anti-Jewish practices and anti-Jewish policies implemented in emulation of Germany's Nuremberg laws. Life was made very difficult for Migrandy as he was conscripted into a forced labor battalion in the Hungarian army, which was fighting alongside the Germans, and he was forced to work as a translator. He managed somehow to leave the army and return to his family in Miskolc, yet the worst was still to come. With the German occupation of Hungary in March 1944, the deportation and extermination of Hungarian Jews began and proceeded rapidly. Between May and July that year, in less than 2 months, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported from the provinces of Hungary in more than 145 trains, my grandfather Béla and his family among them. Separated from his father by Nazi selection, my grandfather and 2 of his able-bodied brothers were deemed able to work, and they were transported to a labor camp. The rest of the family, the old, the women, and the children, were sent straight to the extermination camp of Auschwitz and to their deaths. The family of my grandmother Charlotte suffered in equal measure. Charlotte, working in Budapest as a tutor for a Christian child, had established a close relationship with the child's family, and they bravely agreed to shelter her as if she were one of them. But other of her family members still in Bars were not so fortunate. Just before the direct German occupation, Charlotte's mother, sensing what was to come, came looking for her daughter, desperate to hide with her and the family. Charlotte, fearing that they would both be caught and killed, urged her mother to return to Bars. She was so terrified that it would be obvious to the Nazis that they were both Jews in hiding. Tragically, the Jews in Bars and the surrounding villages were rounded up almost immediately and taken to Auschwitz. Charlotte's mother and many other family members perished in the death camp. This guilt and loss haunted Charlotte for the rest of her life. Years later, as she lay delirious in her hospital bed, dying from cancer, she cried and cried for her mother, begging for her forgiveness. With the defeat of the Nazis and the end of the war, the few surviving Hungarian Jews went looking for their remaining relatives and families. Against this backdrop of destruction and despair, my grandparents Charlotte and Béla were overjoyed to be reunited, and they rekindled their relationship. My father was born soon after, on the 24th of January, 1946. His mother would always tell him how the small Jewish community of Miskolc celebrated with joy at his birth, the hope of a Jewish baby born after so much loss and suffering. But the celebrations didn't last long. After enduring such hatred and persecution at the hands of the Nazis, and with the threat of further pogroms, Charlotte and Béla decided there remained no future for them in Hungary and were determined to leave. They managed to secure a passage on an illegal bus bound for France. The journey was terrifying for Charlotte with her cherished and beloved newborn baby. The other passengers were afraid of having a baby on board and wanted to kill him for fear he would cry when they crossed borders. Yet the bus made it across to France, where my father spent his first few years. Then, with the help of his older sister, who had settled in London years before, Béla succeeded in gaining entry to England. The family moved over to England full of hope for their new life and new beginnings in a new country. So here's a picture of me with my son, Jacob. And here is me with pictures of my sons in England and with hope for the future. And I pass it back to my mum.
Thank you very much, Ruth. So we've got a little bit of time for questions from the audience. We have been asked to make a recording of the event, so if you could just speak into the mic when I bring it round if you have questions, because otherwise it won't transmit to the recording. So any questions? Yes.
Hi, Mickey. It's something I've never mentioned to you before. I was just mentioning it to Jeff. But do we know that had Mum not bought back her certificate of naturalization, whether she would have been able to teach and continue with her career. I mean, in other words, did she have to buy it back, or could she have just said, no, I'm not going to buy it back yet?
Actually, I don't know the answer to your question, really, but I think people who were not naturalized had a harder time getting jobs. She already had a hard time, though, because when my parents married, they went to live in this town called Ware, which some of you may know is near Broxbourne in Hertfordshire. And she wasn't able to get a job there, even though she was a qualified teacher. And the only jobs available were things like cleaners. But it was during that, she felt very, very angry that on the application for citizenship, it said that she had no occupation. So I think you're right that this process was both undignified, but resulted in her being able to eventually work again.
Any other questions? No? Oh, yeah, a few. Okay, so I'll come to you and then you.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I haven't totally formulated the question, but it's around what, I suppose it's like, what has the process given you in terms of a sense of healing or healing, whatever may have come up for you? Does that make sense? Yeah. Has it been a healing journey at all? Yeah, has it been cathartic?
Yes, it has, but the process itself was extremely painful. Sorting through all these letters, reading them all, kind of working out what happened where and when, and finding out things that we weren't told. And I think it's true for lots of children of refugees now as well as then, that they're not told the painful parts of their people want to move on from that pain and try and create a new life. But it has been extremely healing for me eventually, because it's given me a sense of my backstory, and in fact, yes, and well, in particular about my mother, who, as many children feel, more disparaging about their mothers than their fathers, or that was the case in our family and so on. But I realized just how hard she'd had to work during that period of time to try and I had lots of evidence, and it's in the book about who she spoke to and how many ministers she saw during that period. So for me, it has been very cathartic eventually.
With regard to the Isle of Man internment, there was an exhibition about 7-8 years ago, which was opened by Lady Hennig, Lady Hennig, who died about a year ago, I suppose. And my late sister-in-law was her sister, and she was the first baby to be born, Jewish baby, to be born on the Isle of Man. And they brought the mother outside of the concentration camp to give birth to her. And according to the locals, they told me that the internees were better fed than the local people on the Isle of Man. How true that is, I do not know. But there's probably quite a large record of this exhibition. So,
Was the exhibition in London or?
no, it was in Douglas.
Right.
So, and unfortunately, Ruth has died, so I can't get any further information.
We did, well, as you saw, I went to Ramsey and I went to Douglas as well, and we were taken round many of the camps by the woman who was the curator of the Manx Museum. And so I spent a day in the Manx Museum looking at the records there as well. So I think there is a lot of evidence now, except that the government destroyed a lot of it. They burnt records, they got rid of a lot of the evidence. What is available, there's also in the Manx Library in Douglas, but in the National Archives, you can also find, and I did find evidence of the slips, rather like the AJR slips. There was little index, they're like paper index cards in the National Library, but you can only, they're all filed in a very, I can't understand the filing system, but I could tell you the Home Office, they've all got Home Office numbers, and I did find all the records of my grandparents and my great-grandmother and my father there. And I think, oh, and I also did find the National Archives are awash with information, because I did find my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father, who died in 1921, his naturalization certificate that was issued in 1913. And so by the time I went to the National Archives in Kew, it was closed for 100 years, but I went in about 2000. So it was open again, so I could see that. So there is some of this information, but where the government doesn't want to talk about it, they don't care about the records, so they've lost quite a lot. The only records that are really available are of a camp in Douglas called Hutchinson, where a lot of artists were. Although one of the most famous artists from that period was in Ramsey with my father and his brother.
I think we've got a question here.
There's a date in my own family's history that's quite close to one of your key dates, in that my mother arrived here at the end of June, about a month before the date you mentioned, June 1939, in her case, on the Kindertransport from Vienna. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that growing up in Australia when I did, when we were thought of as called New Australians, my interest in my own family's history was quite selective. And by the time I really wanted to know, my parents weren't around. So I've been putting my own family history together. But one thing I wondered whether in your own unraveling of your family's history, did you find anything about the contemporaneous attitudes to new arrivals here? And also, you mentioned some of your family were in Manchester. I don't know, when they left, but I was wondering if they might have been around at the time of the anti-Jewish riots in 1947, where I think Manchester was one of the key places targeted.
My parents' family had left Manchester then. In fact, I start off the story about it because my parents left in 1941 when they got married, and my grandmother stayed, on my mother's side, stayed until about 1945 when she moved to Southend, and none of that side of the family had children, and
my uncle Ernst had gone. So I don't know about the riots in 1947. Well, my grandmother was still alive in Manchester at that time, my father's mother. She died in 1950, but I don't know. But I do have bits of paper in these files that some of them are a bit moth-eaten now, which show some of the documents about how Jews had to behave during the Second World War, and internees at liberty were just that. They were not at liberty at all. It was a complete contradiction in terms, and they were told how to dress and how to behave in public. So that was during the war itself, but I'm sure that kind of constriction continued. But yeah.
Aside and then a question. When I first, as you can tell, I'm American, and when I came here in '88, I had to go to what was then called the Alien Registration Office. It's nearby Bland's Conduit Street, and that may continue for many years until they moved the office to Croydon. But lots of us found it very sort of humorous at the time that we were going to the Alien Registration Office. A question about the safe. What else did you find in the safe besides personal letters, correspondence? And I'm sort of wondering whether those letters and correspondence were blocked, but somewhat secret because of the sense of concern of what would happen in later years to the Jews, and it would be dangerous to have these things so open. I met someone in Spain who didn't realize her grandmother was Jewish until the woman died and they found a Jewish star and some other things, but she had kept that secret in her life. I'm just wondering whether you think there might have been a sense of secrecy to protect the family in years to come, and or what else was in the locked safe?
Mainly, I remember the passports and some other letters and so on. But I've often speculated on why were they kept, why were they locked. And a year ago, I was talking to somebody who I know from, well, in a more informal context than this, but she told me that she wasn't allowed to have her father's passport. It was seized by the British state, but she found it in the National Archives, but she was only allowed to look at it. Austria. She's a woman called Angela Eden. She might be willing to talk. But in fact, I had a little note to myself to say, why were these locked? And I think you probably answered the question for me, because I think, well, there was a bit of shame about it as well. Yes. Yeah.
The sense of not advertising too much. Sorry, I think there's also the sense of protecting future generations and those around you.
Mm-hmm.
Even in America, I remember just conversations or remarks that you shouldn't go out of your way too much to say that you're Jewish or that whatever. I grew up in a community that my brother and I were the only Jewish kids in our elementary school in New Jersey, but I have to say the teachers were wonderful, that when it came holiday time, half of the bulletin board, they would have us decorate with Hanukkah things, and the other half would be Christmas things. So it was a very welcoming place. Lawrence Township, New Jersey.
Okay, I think we've got time for one final question. I think you were first, actually. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to say about the record keeping, and I was told when I was looking for my parents that they actually destroyed the documentation of the refugees who did not become naturalized, and only kept those of the people who were naturalized.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Reiner. Irena's the one who contributed a chapter to my edited book 3 years ago.
I think we might have time for your question as well. That's a big-
A very quick question, and that is, were they interned because they were German Jewish or because they were German? Was there any distinction? I mean,
It was German. In fact, Nazis were also on the Isle of Man mixed with the Jews. And I think that was one of the most shocking things for me to discover, that German Jews and Nazis were lumped together in the camps.
Well, one of the pictures, yeah, the picture in, I'm not sure it's in the book, but it's on the cover of one of the books about internment, and on Ramsey, in Ramsey, was a picture, a cover picture of one of the Nazis that had died there. But there weren't as many Nazis as there were Jews. There were, most of them were not living in Britain in 1940. So, and there's a lot of evidence about this, and there were 3 different categories of people at the beginning of that period, at the beginning of the war. And my grandparents and my father were classified as C, which was the least dangerous. But by 1940, they were all seen as being dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions and for great answers. So please just join me now in thanking Miriam and Charlotte for a fantastic event. I believe you can get copies of the book, buy copies of the book from them if you are interested in that. So thanks very much for all coming, and hope to see you at future Wiener Library events.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
My pleasure.